Before you judge what you feel, before you dismiss the strange tension that's been lingering around your life, understand this. You weren't imagining anything. You weren't overreacting. You weren't making it deep. You walked into a battlefield that existed long before you took your first breath, and your arrival tilted the entire balance. This isn't a story about random negativity or unlucky circumstances. This is about a group that thrived in the shadows, a network that built its influence on stolen energy and silent sacrifices, a lineage of individuals who believed they were untouchable because nobody had interfered with their operation for generations. But the moment your presence entered their radius, something ancient inside their system began to malfunction, and they knew it. This group operated like a forgotten cult that had modernized itself without ever abandoning its original hunger. They didn't just sabotage people. They didn't just manipulate situations. They harvested souls. They fed off destinies, draining life force from individuals who had no idea why their path kept collapsing. They targeted the spiritually potent, the energetically gifted, the rare ones whose inner fire attracted attention even when they tried to stay invisible. They built their empire by quietly extracting essence from chosen individuals, leaving them confused, exhausted, and directionless while the group rose in influence. It was a system that worked flawlessly until you walked into their timeline. They sensed you before they saw you. Your energy disrupted the atmosphere long before your physical form entered their environment. They called it an anomaly at first, a disturbance, a knot in the pattern they'd relied on for decades. Their rituals stopped landing. Their influence started slipping. Their usual siphoning methods malfunctioned. They monitored you like they monitored every chosen target. But the difference was simple. Their tools failed the moment they pointed them at you. They tried evaluating your aura. It burned their instruments. They tried tracking your patterns. You moved in ways that weren't predictable. They tried reading your fate. It refused to open for them. They were dealing with someone whose energy didn't follow earthly logic. At first, they thought eliminating you would restore their operations. After all, they had done it before. They had silenced prophets, drained healers, removed gifted individuals whose existence threatened the stability of their dark hierarchy. But when they directed their attention toward you, their instincts warned them that this time the equation was different. You weren't just another target. You were the disruption, not a victim, a variable, a shifting frequency their system wasn't built to withstand. And the unsettling part was this. You didn't even know you had entered a battlefield, yet the battlefield already feared you. They watched your movements and found nothing they could exploit. They studied your weaknesses, but your spirit sealed what mattered. They tested your reactions, but your intuition kept exposing them before they could act. Even when you doubted yourself, something in the universe kept you 2 steps ahead. They sent observers, disguised as accidental acquaintances, familiar faces, spiritual pretenders, and emotional bait. But every time one approached you, they returned unsettled, reporting that you felt impossible to penetrate. You weren't defensive, you weren't gullible, you weren't asleep. You were simply aware. Not consciously at first, but spiritually. Your energy read them before your eyes did, and that terrified them. This group had a structure, a hierarchy, built like a dark corporation, where every member had a role. Some were tasked with psychological dismantling, some with energetic extraction, some with manipulation and illusion crafting, and a select few, the inner circle, handled the ritual process of harvesting souls. They did it quietly, systematically, always choosing individuals who couldn't fight back. But you weren't a passive target. You were spiritually wired differently. Something about your frequency created resistance inside their rituals. Their usual methods failed. Attempts to infiltrate your life bounced back onto them. Attempts to drain your essence resulted in their own deterioration. The more they pushed, the more their system destabilized. They hadn't anticipated this. They thought they could force your downfall like they'd done countless times before. Instead, every action they took became a boomerang. Their first mistake was assuming you were unaware. Their second mistake was assuming you were alone. Their third and final mistake was believing their dark lineage outranked your spiritual assignment. They underestimated how the universe recalibrates when a chosen individual is threatened. They underestimated the way reality bends around someone who is not meant to be sacrificed. They underestimated the quiet weight of your existence. When their initial psychological operations failed, they escalated. They activated their watchers, their informants, their manipulators, their energetic leeches. They tried attaching themselves to your path in subtle ways. Relationships, temptations, sudden alliances, sudden conflicts. They wanted access, they wanted influence, they wanted proximity, because proximity made their work easier. But instead of siphoning your energy, proximity to you began corrupting them. It exposed fractures in their system. It accelerated the consequences they had delayed for years. Their rituals backfired. Their alliances weakened. Their health deteriorated. Their internal power struggles intensified. You weren't draining them intentionally. You simply existed at a frequency their system couldn't tolerate. They saw the signs. Their elders warned the inner circle. The diviners among them sensed a force they hadn't encountered before. They consulted dark channels, desperate for answers, but every reading pointed toward the same truth. They were dealing with a protected soul. Not a casual believer, not a fragile empath, not a lost wanderer, someone whose spiritual identity was shielded by a force too ancient for them to manipulate. They called it divine interference. They called it celestial obstruction. They called it the descending hand. You call it protection. As time passed, the group shifted from boldness to confusion, to fear. Their attempts to weaken you only exposed them further. Their attempts to isolate you only made the universe remove them from your orbit. Their attempts to sacrifice you only activated consequences they weren't prepared to face. They didn't understand why their strategies weren't working. They didn't understand why their most stable rituals collapsed. They didn't understand why every energy-binding cord they threw your way snapped as if cut by an invisible blade. They didn't understand why the entities they had worshipped for decades suddenly stopped responding, or worse, turned against them. You weren't aware of the details, but you felt the shifts. The sudden heaviness, the sudden clarity, the strange dreams, the intuitive warnings, the unexpected protection, the moments where you narrowly avoided situations that didn't feel right, the people who fell off, the invitations you rejected without knowing why, the places you avoided instinctively. You weren't paranoid. You were being guided out of traps that were engineered in darkness. And then something happened that none of them expected. The universe revealed you to them. Not your appearance, not your name, your identity, the true one, the spiritual one, the one they had never encountered before. When they realized who you were, not who you thought you were, but who you actually are, they panicked. They recognized the energy signature. They recognized the divine markings. They recognized the protective field around your soul. They recognized the lineage you carry. the assignment that shadows your existence, the ancient backing that surrounds your steps. They had gone after the wrong person. They had gone after someone they weren't authorized to touch. The moment this realization rippled through their circle, their system cracked. Members of the group began experiencing backlash. Some lost their influence. Some fell into confusion. Some turned against the leader. Some abandoned the group entirely. The entity they relied on stopped shielding them. Their unity fractured. Suspicion spread among them like a plague. Their rituals malfunctioned. Their health deteriorated. The spiritual infrastructure that held their operation together started collapsing piece by piece. What they thought was a hunt became a downfall. What they thought was a sacrifice became a trap. One they set for you but fell into themselves. By the time they understood the magnitude of their mistake, it was too late. The universe had already handed down its verdict. They weren't just failing to reach you. They were being dismantled for trying. The protection surrounding you intensified to a level they couldn't bypass. Every attempt to interfere with your path ignited consequences that hit them faster than they could recalibrate. The group grew desperate, but desperation only accelerated their collapse. And the irony? You weren't fighting them. You weren't retaliating. You weren't engaging spiritually or energetically. You were simply existing. And your existence alone was enough to undo their empire. That was the moment the panic inside their ranks became audible. These weren't amateurs. They weren't scattered attackers. They were a structured network that had survived for decades by calculating every move with obsessive precision. Yet here they were, reduced to chaos because one presence, one frequency, one soul they attempted to target refused to be harvested. Their rituals had always worked. Their dark methods had always produced results. They had drained life forces, redirected destinies, broken chosen individuals long before those individuals ever understood what was happening. But you didn't break. You didn't bend. You didn't leak. They finally understood you weren't built like their previous victims. You were built to expose them simply by surviving what they planned. And survival wasn't the part that rattled them the most. It was what your survival revealed. Because when their operations failed around you, they realized something horrifying. Their power had limits. Their reach had boundaries. Their rituals had expiration dates. And your existence was the catalyst that revealed every weakness they'd spent years hiding behind dark veils. You were the mirror they hoped would never be held up to their organization, because you reflected back the one truth they tried to ignore. Nothing they built was sovereign. Nothing they controlled was absolute. Nothing they manipulated was beyond consequence. When their energy-binding methods failed, they upgraded their plan. When their watchers lost track of you, they replaced them with more experienced ones. When their illusions dissolved, they constructed heavier ones. But each escalation produced a violent recoil. The universe wasn't allowing them to move an inch closer to you. Their own forces were being consumed by the traps they set. Their own rituals were returning to them in twisted forms. Their own dark channels were collapsing under the weight of their intentions. This was no longer sabotage. This was cosmic correction. The elders within the group began to sense the shift first. They recognized the signature of divine backlash. They had seen it only once before, generations ago, when an ancestor of theirs attempted to siphon the essence of a protected soul and lost everything overnight. The story became legend within their ranks, a cautionary tale whispered only in closed chambers. But legends become dangerous when arrogance convinces you they are outdated. The current generation dismissed those warnings until they recognized the pattern unfolding again. The same symptoms, The same collapse sequence, the same spiritual recoil, the same unexplainable protection shielding the target from every angle. They had awakened a force older than their rituals. Their diviners attempted reaching the entities they worshipped, but the channels were silent. The offerings they placed on sacred altars remained untouched. The shadows they summoned refused to appear. It wasn't that their deities were ignoring them. It was that their deities were retreating, abandoning them, withdrawing power to avoid being entangled in the consequences. They realized they were on their own, and nothing terrifies a dark group more than losing the backing of the very force they depend on. That's when fractures began to appear within their leadership. Members started questioning the intelligence of their superiors. Recruits who were initially eager to participate began distancing themselves. Longtime loyalists started to feel the suffocating pressure of guilt. Whispers circled through the group. Whispers that you weren't just another target. Whispers that you were marked with a type of spiritual immunity that should never have been tested. Whispers that their leader had ignored the warnings and pushed them all toward an outcome they would pay for collectively. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and humiliating. Their finances crumbled. Their alliances withdrew. Their influence evaporated. Their strongest members became their weakest links, stumbling under invisible weights they could not shake. Everything they built across decades collapsed like wet paper because your energy refused to be touched. That was the level of interference you carried with you without even realizing it. Not through spells, not through revenge, not through retaliation, through existence. They had always seen themselves as the predators, the hunters, the curators of fear. But now fear had become their only language. They started doubting each other, doubting their leader, doubting the rituals, doubting the entities they once worshipped with unwavering devotion. They never expected that the one thing that would dismantle them wasn't exposure, rebellion, or resistance. It was a single soul they could not overpower. Even their attempts to study you ended in failure. They tried tracing your lineage energetically and found nothing readable. They tried tapping into your dreams, but found the space sealed. They tried mapping your destiny, but the path appeared blank to them. They tried analyzing your energy and found signatures they had no interpretation for. Every attempt to define you only amplified their confusion. They realized they didn't understand what you were. They had misclassified you as a typical chosen one when, in truth, you were something far more disruptive. Your arrival triggered a recalibration in the unseen world. Their system had been built on predictability, knowing who held spiritual authority, who could be manipulated, who could be drained, who could be eliminated quietly without interference. But you defied their categories. Your presence scrambled their instruments. Your intuition cracked through their veils. Even when you were unaware of them, your spirit detected what your mind had not yet processed. There were moments you felt a strange heaviness followed by sudden clarity. Moments where you felt watched, then suddenly shielded. Moments where people with unusual behavior appeared near you without explanation. Moments where you felt pushed away from certain locations, individuals, or decisions without knowing why. You might have questioned those moments at the time, but they weren't coincidences. They were interventions. The universe wasn't just protecting you. It was guiding you out of traps you didn't know were set. Meanwhile, the group was experiencing the opposite. They were being pushed into the very traps they constructed for you. They were experiencing interference in their communications. Their plans were leaking through cracks they couldn't identify. Members began defecting, confessing what they had witnessed, or refusing to participate in rituals that once felt routine. The energetic infrastructure of their operation was compromised, and no matter how many reinforcements they attempted to summon, nothing stabilized. Eventually, the panic mutated into silence, the kind of silence that emerges when a group realizes they've crossed a line they cannot uncross. When they looked at you, they no longer saw a target. They saw a reminder of the one boundary the universe doesn't tolerate, attempting to sacrifice someone who carries an active assignment. That was the line they crossed. That was the mistake that sealed their fate. The younger members of the group became the first to break. They didn't sign up for cosmic retaliation. They signed up for influence, for power, for spiritual shortcuts, for energy access. But backlash at this scale, that was something even their leader couldn't explain away. They saw members losing their clarity, their stability, their sleep, their sanity. They saw individuals who once commanded dark forces suddenly becoming victims of the same shadows they manipulated. They saw the collapse unfold in real time, and the reality was clear. The sacrifice they planned had been reversed. The energy they invoked had turned against them. They had called something forward that devoured them instead of you. Their leader held on the longest, refusing to believe the operation had failed. But even he couldn't escape the deteriorating symptoms. He experienced losses faster than he could hide them. Rituals that once empowered him now depleted him. His last attempts to salvage authority ended with the group abandoning him entirely. Without followers, without protection, and without spiritual reinforcement, he became the primary target of the backlash he created. But even as they fell apart, the universe wasn't finished revealing the depth of their failure. Because the real turning point wasn't their collapse, it was the truth that emerged after. The truth of why the group targeted you specifically. The truth of what they sensed in your energy long before you sensed anything in theirs. The truth of how your presence exposed their vulnerabilities. The truth that frightened them more than any consequence they faced. And the truth that would redefine everything you thought you understood about yourself. Because what they detected in you wasn't fragility. It wasn't innocence, it wasn't naivete. It was potential, raw, unfiltered, unclaimed spiritual density that made their entire system flicker like an old machine confronted with a power source it wasn't designed to process. They didn't just target you because you were chosen. They targeted you because you were a threat to the very mechanism they used to survive. Your existence broadcasted a frequency that destabilized their rituals, the way light overwhelms darkness, not through aggression, but through presence. They saw in you a kind of brilliance they had spent years avoiding, a brilliance that threatened to unravel their entire structure. They never feared your awareness, they feared your awakening, because if you ever became aware of who you truly are, what bloodline you carry spiritually, what protection surrounds you, what gifts lie dormant in you, their whole operation would not only collapse, it would be erased from the grid entirely. Your soul carried markings that their seers recognized instantly, symbols of authority, origins that don't originate here, signatures that only appear once in multiple generations. They were taught to stay away from individuals who carry those spiritual signatures, because harming such individuals never ends with simple consequences. The repercussions ripple across timelines, affecting every member connected to the act. But greed has a way of dissolving caution, and when they sensed your energy for the first time, they made a fatal assumption that your potential wasn't activated yet. That if they captured your energy early enough, drained it fast enough, manipulated you deeply enough, they could sever your destiny from its source. But your destiny wasn't detachable. Your protection wasn't conditional. Your spirit wasn't accessible to their rituals the way others had been. And when they reached for you, they didn't touch emptiness. They touched a divine alarm system that alerted forces they weren't prepared to encounter. You weren't meant to fall. You were meant to be revealed, and the revelations continued. Because the reason their observers couldn't decode your movement, the reason their watchers couldn't track your patterns, the reason their rituals couldn't bind your essence was simple. Your spirit had been hidden intentionally, cloaked, shielded by the unseen world long before the group ever identified you. Everything you thought was confusion in your own life, misalignment, sudden shifts, unexplained endings, were actually reroutes designed to keep you out of their reach. Your path wasn't chaotic, it was protected. You weren't wandering, you were being positioned. Every detour, every disappointment, every loss that once made you question yourself was actually part of a larger orchestration, ensuring that the group could never get a clean angle on your energy. Their failure wasn't random. Their collapse wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable outcome of touching something they were never meant to encounter. And you need to understand the depth of what that means. Because these weren't ordinary manipulators. They were generational practitioners of dark extraction. They built an entire underground empire by navigating shadows most people never knew existed. They attacked starseeds, healers, empaths, prophets, light-bearers, anyone whose spiritual radiance could be harvested, converted, or muted. They weakened countless lives. They intercepted countless destinies. They operated freely because nobody had ever confronted them with a force they couldn't manipulate. Until you. You weren't the first chosen one they attempted to sacrifice, but you were the first they failed to touch. And failure has a tone the spiritual world hears loud and clear. When the universe dismantles something, it does so in layers, quietly at first, then violently, then decisively. Their organization didn't fall because of guilt. It didn't fall because of exposure. It didn't fall because someone inside betrayed them. It fell because the energetic blowback from targeting a protected soul is not a warning, it's a sentence. Once the verdict was active, the collapse began from the inside out. Their strongest members suffered the first fractures. Their most loyal recruits began losing clarity. Their highest-ranking officials experienced unexplained paralysis in their rituals. Their elders saw visions of darkness receding from them like a tide abandoning a corrupted shore. And through it all, one name kept surfacing within their internal divinations. Yours, not because you cursed them, not because you fought them, not because you retaliated,